They say Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. The history books will tell you that his heart finally gave out in his Beverly Hills home, surrounded by the silence he had come to crave. The obituaries listed his movies, his songs, his jokes, and his legendary coolness. They spoke of emphysema and old age. But his friends knew the truth. They knew that the man who died in 1995 was just a shell, a ghost haunting a body that had forgotten how to live. The real Dean Martin, the man who laughed, the man who loved, the man who lit up every room he entered, actually died 8 years earlier on a snowy mountainside in California. He died on March 21st, 1987, the day a telephone call brought him to his knees and ripped the soul right out of his chest. Because on that day, the king of cool didn't lose his fame. He didn't lose his money. He didn't lose his voice. He lost his son. And when he lost his son, he lost the only reason he had to keep playing the game. This is the heartbreaking, untold story of the night the music stopped forever. To understand the magnitude of the tragedy that destroyed Dean Martin, you first have to understand the bond he shared with his son, Dean Paul Martin, known to the world and his family simply as Dino Jr. In the constellation of the Martin family, Dino was the brightest star. He was everything Dean was and everything Dean wanted to be. Handsome, talented, athletic, and possessed of that same effortless charm that made his father a legend. Dino was the golden boy. He was a tennis pro who played at Wimbledon. He was an actor who starred in movies and TV shows. He was a musician in the rock band Dino, Daisy and Billy. But more than all of that, he was a pilot, a captain in the California Air National Guard, flying F-4 Phantom jets. To Dean, Dino was his validation. He was the proof that Dean had done something right in this crazy world. They were more than father and son. They were best friends. They played golf together. They cracked jokes together. They understood each other in a way that didn't require words. Dean, a man who famously kept everyone at arm's length, who built a wall of cool around himself that no one could penetrate, lowered the drawbridge for Dino. Dino was the only one who truly saw the man behind the tuxedo. He called him Captain. He bragged about him to anyone who would listen. "That's my boy," he would say. "He flies jets. I just sing songs." It was a humble brag, but it was the truest thing Dean ever said. He revered his son. And that reverence was what made the events of March 1987 not just a tragedy, but a spiritual execution. March 21st, 1987 started like any other Saturday in Los Angeles. But in the San Bernardino Mountains, a beast was waking up. A freak snowstorm was swirling around the peaks of Mount San Gorgonio, the highest point in Southern California. The weather was treacherous. Thick clouds, blinding snow, and winds that howled like banshees. Captain Dean Paul Martin and his Weapons System Officer Captain Ramon Ortiz were scheduled for a routine training mission. They took off from March Air Force Base in the afternoon. The mission was simple, but on this day, nature was the superior force. Dean Martin was at home in Beverly Hills, watching television, completely unaware that 60 miles away, his world was about to end. At 1:52 p.m., Dino's jet requested a turn to avoid the towering clouds blocking their path. The controller approved. But in the confusion of the storm, amidst the swirling whiteout that erased the horizon, something went terribly wrong. The jet, traveling at over 400 mph, didn't turn away from the mountain. It turned directly into it. In the blinding snow, Dino wouldn't have seen the mountain until it was far too late. There would have been no time to scream, no time to be afraid. One moment, they were flying. The next, there was only darkness. The jet impacted the sheer granite face at high velocity. The explosion was muffled by the heavy snow. A silent fireball, quickly extinguished by the blizzard. Back in Beverly Hills, the phone hadn't rung yet. Dean was safe. He was calm. He didn't know that his golden boy had just been erased from the sky. But the silence was coming. The radar blip had vanished. The controllers called out. "Phantom 6, come in. Phantom 6, do you read?" Static. Just static. And in that static lay a nightmare that would consume Dean Martin for the rest of his life. When the phone finally rang at Dean's house, the voice on the other end wasn't Dino. It was an official from the Air National Guard. "Mr. Martin, Your son's plane is missing. Those words are the most terrifying sentence a parent can hear. Missing. It implies hope, but it carries the weight of doom. For the next 3 days, Dean Martin entered a personal hell. The storm on the mountain was so severe that search and rescue teams couldn't get near the crash site. Helicopters were grounded, foot patrols were turned back by avalanches, and zero visibility. These 72 hours were the longest 3 days of Dean Martin's life. And that telephone sitting next to his chair had never felt heavier. Dean sat in his living room. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He chain-smoked pack after pack of cigarettes. He stared at the telephone as if by sheer force of will he could make it ring with good news. He imagined scenarios. Maybe Dino had ejected. Maybe he was sitting on the mountainside wrapped in his parachute, waiting for rescue. Dean clung to these fantasies with the desperation of a drowning man. Friends came by. Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Jerry Lewis called. But Dean barely spoke to them. He was in a trance of agony. He wasn't the king of cool anymore. He was just a frightened father trembling in his pajamas. He paced the floor, muttering prayers he hadn't said since he was a boy in Ohio. Please, God, take everything. Take the money. Take the fame. Just give me the boy. But the storm raged, on covering the mountain in a shroud of white, hiding the wreckage and the truth. Every hour that passed without news was torture. Finally, on the 3rd day, the weather broke. The search helicopters lifted off. They spotted the scar on the granite face. They spotted the wreckage. There was no parachute. There was no survivor. When the confirmation came that Dino was gone, that he had died instantly upon impact, Dean didn't scream. He didn't throw things. He simply collapsed inward. It was as if the strings that held his puppet body together had been cut. The light in his eyes, that mischievous twinkle that had charmed the world for 40 years, flickered out and died. He hung up the phone and sat in his favorite chair, staring at a blank television screen. The silence in the room was deafening. It was the sound of a heartbreaking beyond repair. The funeral was a blur of black limousines, weeping celebrities, and military honors. A folded American flag. The sound of taps played on a lonely bugle. Dean Martin was there physically, but spiritually, he was miles away. He moved like a robot. He wore his dark glasses not to look cool, but to hide eyes that were swollen and dead. People tried to comfort him. He died a hero, they said. He didn't suffer. Dean nodded politely, but he didn't hear them. All he could hear was the silence where his son's laugh used to be. At the graveside, Dean looked older than his years. The vitality that had defined him was gone, replaced by a gray, hollow fragility. He touched the casket, a gentle, lingering touch, as if he were tucking Dino in for the night one last time. Witnesses say he whispered something, but no one knows for sure what it was. Maybe it was "I love you." Maybe it was "wait for me." After the funeral, Dean retreated into his fortress on Mountain Drive. He shut the gates. He stopped returning calls. He stopped going out. The world wanted Dean Martin back, but Dean Martin didn't want the world. He felt betrayed by life. He had played by the rules. He had worked hard, provided for his family, entertained millions, and this was his reward, to bury his child. It made no sense. It was a cruel joke. And for the first time in his life, Dean didn't find the joke funny. He sat in his room watching old westerns on a loop. Why westerns? Because in westerns, the good guys won. In westerns, death had a reason. In westerns, the world was simple. The complex, painful reality of 1987 was too much to bear. A year later, in 1988, Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. tried to save him. They saw their friend fading away, dying of a broken heart. They came up with a plan. A massive reunion tour. Together again. The Rat Pack back on stage. Frank thought the applause would heal Dean. He thought the music would bring him back to life. Frank was wrong. Dean didn't want to be healed. He just wanted to be left alone. But Dean, ever the loyal friend, agreed. He didn't want to let Frank and Sammy down. The Patete tour started, and it was a disaster for Dean. Arena after arena, city after city, he looked more lost. He would forget lyrics. He would flick his cigarette ashes onto the stage floor with a look of utter disdain. The old magic was gone. He looked at the audience and saw thousands of strangers who wanted him to be funny while his heart was bleeding. It reached a breaking point. Dean turned to Frank on stage and mumbled, "I want to go home." Frank tried to push him. "Come on, Dee, let's knock him dead." But Dean had nothing left to give. He threw his cigarette down, walked off the stage, and went straight to the airport. He flew home, leaving the tour, leaving the money, leaving the legend behind. That night was the last time the real Rat Pack ever existed. Dean had walked away not out of arrogance but out of exhaustion. He had realized that no amount of applause could fill the hole in his life. The final 7 years of Dean Martin's life were a study in solitude. He didn't become a recluse. He just became a man who was finished with the noise. He established a quiet routine. Every evening he would dress for dinner out of habit and self-respect and go to his favorite Italian restaurant, La Famiglia or Da Vinci. He would sit at the same table. The staff knew not to disturb him. They would bring him his pasta fagioli, his bread, his glass of wine. And often Dean would have them set a place setting for the empty chair opposite him. Some said he was waiting for Frank. Others whispered he was waiting for a woman. But those who knew him understood. That empty chair was for Dino. He was having dinner with his son. He would sit there for hours, eating slowly, sipping his wine, staring into the middle distance, lost in a conversation that only he could hear. Fans would sometimes approach him, asking for an autograph. Dean would always be polite. He would sign the napkin, smile that sleepy smile, and say, "You're welcome, pal." But the eyes were vacant. They were the eyes of a man who was just waiting for the check so he could go home. He told a friend once, "I'm not afraid of dying. Why should I be? Everyone I love is already there." It was a profound statement of faith and fatigue. And then the end finally came. It was Christmas Day, 1995. Dean Martin lay in his bed. His breathing was shallow. The emphysema caused by a lifetime of cigarettes had claimed his lungs, but it was the grief that had claimed his will to breathe. He was 78 years old. As the world outside celebrated, Dean Martin closed his eyes. There was no struggle, no panic, just a gentle exhaling. A final release of the burden he had carried for 8 years. The silence he had sought for so long finally embraced him completely. When the news broke, the lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed in his honor. The world mourned the loss of an icon. Frank Sinatra, devastated and frail, wept for his brother. But for those who really loved Dean, there was a sense of relief. They knew that he wasn't suffering anymore. They knew that somewhere in the great beyond, the pilot had landed and the father was waiting at the gate. We don't know if every detail is true, but the people who were there say that in his final days, Frank Sinatra, lost in the fog of dementia, would often call out for Dean. He would forget that Dean was gone. He would ask his nurse, "Where's Dino? Is he coming over?" Maybe in his mind he was back with his friend, waiting for Dean to walk through the door one more time. The tragic irony of Dean Martin's life is that he spent 40 years trying to make us laugh. But his story ended in tears. Yet in that tragedy there is a beautiful lesson. It teaches us that fame is nothing, money is dust, and awards are just metal. The only thing that truly matters, the only thing that can break a man like Dean Martin, is love. He loved his son so much that he couldn't survive without him, and that, in its own heartbreaking way, is the most noble legacy of all. So the next time you hear "That's Amore," don't just hear the jokes and the Italian charm. Listen to the voice, listen to the warmth, and remember the man who died of a broken heart on a snowy mountain, and the father who spent his last years staring at an empty chair, waiting for his boy to come home. Rest in peace, Dino. You finally got your wings. This is Dean Martin Legacy Stories. If this story moved you, hit like and share it with someone who understands the depth of a father's love. Subscribe to honor the man behind the legend of the King of Cool. Until next time, keep swinging, pal.